Welcome back, everyone. In the last session, we began with models of resilience and progressed with additive models of resilience. In today's session, we are going to continue with the other type of variable focus models, that is, the interactive model of resilience as well as the indirect model of resilience. It is important to explore and understand the various factors that actually create a difference when people are facing adversity. In this context, the topic of moderators and protective factors are significant to study. A moderator is anything that influences the relationship between a risk factor and the outcome variable. Risk factor present in an individual's life will have a negative or unfavorable influence on the outcome variable. This, in case, is the optimal functioning of an individual. There is no doubt about it. But there is also the presence of a moderator variable which is going to affect how this risk factor will influence or bring changes in the outcome variable. There can be many such moderators such as safe neighborhood, family relations, communications within the family, self-perceptions, socioeconomic status, and many more. These moderators can be within the individual, within the family, or within the community also. Such moderators can also be called as vulnerability factors or protective factors. Let us begin with the first interactive model now. The first interactive model is a simple moderator model. In this model, there is a risk factor which has a negative influence on the outcome variable. This relationship is moderated by a protective or a vulnerability factor. A protective factor will be one which has a positive influence on the relationship between risk and outcome variable. It will decrease the susceptibility of the individual to the risk situation, whereas a vulnerability factor will increase the susceptibility of the individual to the risk situation, thereby having a negative influence. An example of a protective factor can be good family communications, helpful neighbors, etc. Whereas that of a vulnerability factor can be socio-economic disadvantage. Let us understand this with the help of an example. There is a risk factor present in an individual's life, physical abuse, which is creating a negative influence on his competence. This negative relationship can be moderated by either support from parents or by lecture from parents regarding shame and guilt. If this relationship is affected by support from parents, it will reduce the impact of physical abuse on his competence, thus acting as a protective factor. On the other hand, if this relationship is affected by shameful lectures from parents regarding shame or guilt, it can increase the impact of physical abuse on his competence, thus acting as a vulnerability factor. Well, this was the first kind of interactive model. Another kind of interactive model is one wherein moderator is called a risk-activated protective factor. This simply means that sometimes protective factors are actually triggered by occurrence of any adversity or risk situation. Thus, the risk occurs which has a negative influence on our criterion of interest. This risk also activates the protective factor, which in turn reduces the impact of risk on our criterion of interest or the outcome variable. Let us move on to understand this with the help of an example. This example is the same one which we discussed earlier. There is a risk factor in an individual's life, physical abuse, which is creating a negative influence on his competence. This risk factor triggered support and communication in the family which was earlier absent from an individual's life. The support and encouragement from family reduces the impact of risk factor on the competence of the child, thereby serving as a threat activated protective factor. A very common example which can be seen in our daily life works on this model. In normal circumstances, in our automobiles, airbags usually do not have any function. But when the airbag system detects a threat that an accident is about to happen, it suddenly activates in order to protect us from any injury. Thus, airbags are a kind of risk activated protective factor. Now let us move on to the final model of variable focused approach, the indirect model of resilience. In this kind of model, we can observe mediation effects where a variable which exerts powerful influence on outcome is itself affected by risk or assets, thus becoming a mediator. In this context, assets which directly influence the outcome variable can either be influenced by risks or resources. Thus, assets itself becomes a mediator in the relationship between risk or resources and outcome variable. Therefore, we can say that risk or resources indirectly affect an outcome variable. We shall move on to discussing an example which will make the concept more clear. In any home setting, the behavior of parents directly affect a child's outcome on any criterion of interest. Now let us suppose there is some socio-economic crisis which is affecting the behavior of parents. The parents became more irritated and angry and frustrated. So there is a change in the behavior of parents which is automatically going to affect the child's outcome behavior. Thus, we can conclude from this example that even though economic crisis had no direct influence on a child's behavior, it will have an indirect influence on the child's behavior via parents' behavior. The parents' behavior acted as a mediator between economic crisis and the behavior of the child. This was one type of indirect model. Now let's move on to another type of indirect model. In this model, there is the invisible effect of total prevention when a powerful protective factor prevents the risk factor from occurring at all. The protective factor is so powerful that it does not even allow the risk factor to occur at all. For example, the proactiveness of an involved parent can alleviate any risk factor prior to its occurrence in a child's life. With this, we complete the various types of variable focus models of resilience. In our next session, we are going to begin with person focused models of resilience. Thank you and have a nice day.